Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, October the 14th, and today the verdict on the conference season, at least as far as the polls are concerned, is in. But to channel Taylor Swift, has everything changed? I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Let's be honest, Anne, we both had a fantastic time across the conferences doing extra podcasts, which you're listening to in ever greater numbers, I have to say, meeting listeners and doing what we rarely do, which is hang out in person. Now, party conference matters for the internal dynamics of the parties, but what about the voters? What did people at home make of them? That really matters too. We reveal all in a moment.
But he also repeated that the UK would play an active role decommissioning the weaponry of Hamas, drawing on our experience from Northern Ireland. It'll be interesting to see whether that parallel works out in practice. And again, he ducked questions about how far he personally backs Tony Blair to sit on the peace board for the transitions in Gaza. But he did repeat that the UK would play an active role decommissioning the weaponry of Hamas, drawing on our experience in Northern Ireland. It will be intriguing, at least, to see how that works in practice.
Possibly slightly groggy Prime Minister will be chairing Cabinet this morning. Top of the grid, top of the internal list of news stories the government want to get out there, however, is an announcement by Steve Reid, now the Housing Secretary. He's announcing a whole raft of amendments to the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, this sort of juggernaut bill that's currently in the Lords, to tilt things yet further in favour of builders and against the blockers. And do you want to just give us a flavour of what that includes?
Yes, well, these include allowing developers to pay to offset environmental damage caused by building, and that will make it harder for councillors to stop small developments and easier for the government to compulsorily purchase land. There's a long list. Rachel Reeves has given a punchy quote, arguably punchier than the sort of thing she often says in interviews, in which she stated that the outdated planning system has been, as she put it, gummed up by burdensome bureaucracy, held to ransom by blockers for too long. Our pro-growth planning bill shows, she said, we are serious about cutting red tape to get Britain building again. So some movement there.
This stuff really matters to Rachel Reeves, and not just because she loves a good high-vis photo opportunity. The reason that the government is doing what it's doing, rushing through these changes now, which are amendments to the planning bill, which is towards the later stages of the parliamentary process, is because they want this stuff to become law soon, right? The amendments will be formally announced in the Lords next week, and they hope within weeks this whole bill has got royal assent, providing there's not too much of a fuss, right? Why is that? Because only if it becomes law, it gets royal assent and is on the statute books, and therefore people can start using the provisions in it. Can the Office for Budget Responsibility work out whether it can credibly boost growth? They can't say that a piece of legislation that hasn't passed yet can boost growth. They can only assess whether a piece of legislation that is on the statute books and is all done and dusted by Parliament can boost growth, otherwise it can change. And of course, then, the argument the government is going to be making is that they want the OBR to score this positively as growth so that they can reduce the 20 to 30 billion pound black hole that otherwise Rachel Reeves will have to fill in the budget with tax rises, with a bit of net it off with a bit of this theoretical future growth. So that's the argument going on behind the scenes. The Treasury will be saying to the OBR, look at all these things. When they become law, we think they're going to boost growth. So that means we don't have to borrow as much. So that means that the black hole is a bit smaller, right? That's the game going on behind the scenes. That's why they're amending the existing planning bill. A small scoopette for you, Anne. There were stories all over the summer about the government coming back for more with a second planning bill. Now, in some ways, this would mark the failure of the first because it's just so instead they're doing just some amendments to this one. But as of now, the public line of this government is there may well not be a second planning bill. So all of those stories about big changes, well, at the moment, the government is telling me privately there is no second planning bill. That may not happen. We haven't decided yet. I can't work out in my own mind whether that's because they don't want to scare the horses and get the first one on the statute books, or because they've given up on the bolder reforms that would go to war with nature groups, right? But that is nevertheless the situation. So things are a little bit more incremental rather than big bangs.
Always love a scoopette in the morning. Speaking of Rachel Reeves, she's off to Washington this evening for her annual gathering of the IMF and World Bank and the annual Chancellor Dinner with Economics editors. But overall, it's feeling like a week in which China keeps nabbing the news lines where the government would like us to focus on something else. And the National Cybersecurity Centre's annual review is out. It brands China a highly sophisticated and capable threat actor. Let's note threat actor, which sounds a bit like calling the Middle Kingdom, oh, I don't know, enemy or security threat, except that's not the language that we're going to get, especially not on the day when Ollie Robbins, by chance, the Foreign Office Permanent Secretary, is visiting Beijing. But my colleague Mason Boycott ploughed through that cyber security list of nationally significant cyber attacks on Britain, including ransomware on the high street. That went up, Sam, from 89 to 204. Highly significant attacks rose from 12 to 18. What do you make of that?
I think cyber attacks are quite central to the China argument. Look, there's a lot that people will say to the likes of you and me in private, Anne, that simply doesn't get said on the record. But I was hearing one account in the last 24 hours of how the Chinese people inside government believe the Chinese are coming for bits of our infrastructure, including the NHS. There is an allegation put to me that China is behind NHS cyber attacks. But will anybody go on the record? Will anyone say that publicly and risk jeopardizing trading relations? No, they absolutely will not. And to be clear, I don't know whether it's Chinese state or a Chinese state-related actor or just a Chinese protagonist in this. But nevertheless, the threat that gets talked about in private that you will hear and I will hear is not matched by the public language of people who represent the government on the record.
Yeah, I have a small amount of irritation about that. I think these are now so frequent, and we know that with big attacks on the high street, and certainly, as you say, that is the running suspicion if you talk to people around the NHS and its security systems. And at some point, you feel a degree of clarity about which actors are thought to be behind which attacks, which some of which I think are known within the boundaries of certainty to the security services should probably be shared with the public. But not now, it seems. And speaking of anti spy tactics, we do have a fun line here from last night's PLP meeting, playbook, hearing that the new chief whip, Jonathan Reynolds, asking if MPs could be more circumspect when gossiping in public after two were heard on the Victoria line, having a good old gossip. I'd love to know what it was about. And Jonathan, he was warning that this sort of thing, Sam, gets straight back to lobby hacks. Can you imagine?
I absolutely can. In fact, I was on the train journey with the producer I work with the other day where he was urging me to gossip a little quieter. So it's not just MPs, it's us hacks as well, speaking too loudly on trains. Got to be careful. Who knows where everything will end up. Right. I think you're completely right. We keep being dragged back to China this week. And the person in the firing line there is the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell. Now, government is doing its best to shore him up. And last night in the Commons, Dan Jarvis, the security minister, was saying that all of the decisions and all of the interactions between the Crown Prosecution Service and government to do with the collapsed China spy trial actually fell on the shoulders of Jonathan Powell's deputy, somebody called Matt Collins. Now, come on to him in a second, but clearly there is some regard for sort of looking after Jonathan Powell in government. And a civil servant to me last night was just saying they wonder whether or not Jonathan Powell just gets up and walks out. Because I was very struck by another conversation I had in August, even before any of this happened, who would by an official who was looking at working with Jonathan Powell up close. He said, look, he just looks absolutely like the burden of this government is on his shoulders. There's so much foreign affairs. It's all going through him. He looks completely wrung out, was the phrase back from nearly 2 months ago. And that was before he was dragged into the public domain. You know, he's quite a well-liked figure. I don't find people who criticize him. And, you know, I listened to Keir Starmer on the telly last night and heaping praise on an official, which Keir Starmer does not do by name very often. He's kind of he's quite particular about not doing that, but he did do that yesterday. And I just wondered whether part of naming and publicly praising Jonathan Powell, one dimension that is a bit of, we really love you, please don't quit. Because I think he is actually responsible for quite a lot of the success of this government's foreign policy in the view of many. Of course, that's the subject up for the debate at the moment. Um, anyway, just a small point. So we discovered that the government in the Commons yesterday was blaming this guy, Matt Collins, Deputy National Security Advisor. Eagle-eyed listeners to this podcast will know that we told you yesterday that was the strategy of the government, that it was the Deputy National Security Advisor that was making all the decisions. So if you listen to us, you get it here first.
I just had a very small vignette about Jonathan Powell, who I've known in many incarnations. Some people like Jonathan a lot. He's very direct. He speaks his mind. Some people find him a tad aloof and not always the most sort of social and party figure, although he can be relaxed, when he decides he's going to be, but you feel it's a bit of a decision. And he turned up at a great gathering of to say farewell to an outgoing head in the intelligence community recently, but he turned up very late, by which time the drink had nearly run out. But he then sort of said in a quite Jonathan Powell way, I said, well, I really felt I should come, because if I didn't come, even if it was very late, people would say I didn't come, because of course there's that ongoing tension over how to handle China. So he felt that on his list was dutifully go to party just when the drink ran out. So on to our broader verdict on the conference season. Two main speeches by Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch steadied the ship for both of them, but did the public notice? And in particular, has that eye-catching stamp duty promise done for Badenoch what the promise to abolish inheritance tax did for David Cameron all those moons ago, when it pretty much saved his leadership and stopped an early election? So, Sam, the scores on the doors from YouGov.
Okay, it's quite a big moment when you do the first poll after a conference season, because you find out what's changed. We've got three sets of numbers for you. We've got voting intention, which is a good way of working out, did anything move the dial? And then we've got stuff on the individual parties, and then we've got stuff on the individual politicians. So here we go, voting intention for the first week after the conference season. And the conference season has made basically no difference at all. And Reform unchanged on 27, Labour on 20%, unchanged on the week, Conservatives on 17, unchanged on the week, Liberal Democrats on 16, down 1, Greens up 1 on 13, that green figure, interestingly, nudging up a tiny bit. Okay, so the stamp duty announcement has not moved the dial in its first week. Right, let's go through party favourability figures. Right, so the Tories on minus 39. Now, the significance of that, so they're in net negative territory. You've got the unfavourable, people who say that the Tories are unfavourable, minus that from the people that say it's favourable. Big net minus figure, they're all net minus figures. Net minus 39, unchanged on mid-August to the digit. Labour minus 41, down a smidgen from minus 37. Lib Dems down a bit to minus 7 from minus 4 in August. Reform UK on minus 29, down from minus 24. So Reform's tiny bit less popular. So, but broadly speaking, in the eyes of the public, the parties didn't change their reputations as a result of conference season. Now let's look at the individuals. Kemi Badenoch now on minus 33, having been minus 35 a week ago. That's actually because more people went into the don't know column rather than the people who have a favourable opinion on her go up. Keir Starmer unchanged on minus 50. He was minus 50 just over a week ago. Ed Davey, small improvement. He's now on minus 7, having been minus 15. Nigel Farage, well, he's on minus 36. A week ago, he was on minus 37. And Zach Polanski, actually showing the biggest change. The Greens had their conference over the weekend, minus 9 compared to minus 16 last week. So a huge amount of effort goes into conference season, not least from you and me, Anne, but it didn't change the view of voters back home. What do you make of all those numbers?
I think it's really interesting that so little changed, given that the conferences felt pretty interesting this year. They weren't just kind of holding patterns. We saw Labour take the fight to reform, using the word racist about aspects of reform policy. That certainly grabbed headlines. That was on screens a lot. And then we had Kemi Badenoch, generally seen to have done pretty good job in her speech, and a better and a more settled, perhaps friendlier tone. And yet, as you say, apart from that minor difference there around favourability, that doesn't seem to have cut through. And one Tory strategist, I have to say, when everyone else was out at the drinks parties afterwards saying, didn't our Kemi do well, made this point to me that there was a dangerous moment then when and if it didn't cut through, because there's clearly more work to do there, or maybe a position is just so invidious because of the march of reform that it would be a bit deflating to find that what we're seen as having been a bit more of a starry Badenoch moment then just didn't yield very much immediately afterwards. I guess you could say, and I wonder what you think about this, and you'd say the same for Keir Starmer, though, to be honest, I think he'll just be happy that things didn't get worse. I think they were looking so bad before conference. He's just going like the clappers, isn't he? He's everywhere in the world. He's really, just showing he's put the prime in prime minister. But do you think that maybe it's going to take a bit longer for any of this to settle with the public? Or do you think, from experience of these things in previous outings, that quite quickly whether conference could make any difference? Does it seep into the water a bit more slowly?
I think it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge particularly for the Tories because, yes, maybe things will seep in to the bloodstream over time. But the bottom line, Anne, is that the moment where the maximum publicity light was shining on Kemi Badenoch and the Tories was their conference. You don't get that amount of publicity again if you're the leader of the opposition and you're on, 17% in the polls. You don't get the spotlight shone on you very often. They had pretty much, a good couple of days in order to marshal their arguments. The first half of the conference felt a bit messy. Yes, she gave a good speech, but there isn't going to be a moment to represent her stamp duty plan to the public in the way that she did it. And if they didn't notice first time around, I think it's going to be quite challenging. I think Labour, as you say, will be quite happy, except for one thing. Look at that figure for the Greens. Greens now on 13%. They're within 3 percentage points of the Lib Dems, right? Make no mistake about it. The new leader, Zach Polanski, who we were touching on yesterday, he is a figure of the left, proudly, sort of eco-socialist. And Jeremy Corbyn's very explicit. He wants to work with Zach Polanski and the Greens. You do have the left bloc with its potential to eat into Labour vote now looking like it has the potential, I'm going to put it no more strongly than that, it has the potential to become a bit of a force. Now, remember back to the MRP, the big polling projection before the conference season, even sort of 10, 11, 12, 13% doesn't necessarily get you many seats because I think the left vote is pretty fragmented, as Jeremy Corbyn found out, so it doesn't translate into seats. But even so, that percentage, if it's draining vote away from the Labour Party, will make it harder to do that.
And switching lanes to reform, holding position there at 27%, not moving up. But there is change afoot that I think we should note, and maybe to come back to, Sam, on the podcast. Richard Tice, their deputy leader at Reform, saying now that Reform would concentrate on cutting the civil service and scrapping net zero rather than delivering those £90 billion of tax cuts promised in its manifesto, which Richard Tice was the figure who had to front that, or chose to front that. But he does see himself as the nearest thing Reform has to a sort of shadow finance minister. And in the internal conversation, he has been advocating for more focused pledges to get away from the charge that Reform is one big black hole waiting to happen. And that is a twin attack from Labour and the Tories. Interesting to me to see Reform clearly seeing that as a problem and beginning to move away from its commitment. But what will its voters who thought that they might be about to get a bonanza make of that?
We will see. Cutting back and living within your means, if you're a podcast and the alarm's gone off, is very important. We can tell Richard Tice and all other finance ministers that for free. So we will see you tomorrow. There's lots of exciting stuff coming up on tomorrow's podcast. So make sure you tune in. I don't even know where you're going to be, and don't spoil the surprise. But we will be doing all sorts of fun stuff in 24 hours. So see you then.
It's going to be a big one. See you tomorrow.